Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us. My name is Sam Gant, and I'm a Master in Public Policy student at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm also a member of the Behavioral Insights Student Group Leadership Committee. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Cristina Bicchieri, who is joining us from the University of Pennsylvania, where she holds many roles. She is the S.J.P. Harvey Professor of Social Thought and Comparative Ethics in the Philosophy and Psychology departments. She's a professor of legal studies at the Wharton School. She is the director of the undergraduate Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program and director of the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. Dr. Bicchieri is the author of 7 books, including The Grammar of Society and Norms in the Wild. And she has a connection to the Harvard Kennedy School. She spent 2 years at Harvard on a Ford Fellowship. As a fun fact, Cristina has been knighted by the Republic of Italy in 2007. Cristina's work is focused on collective behaviors, which can be broadly defined as something that a lot of people are doing. And there's a lot of complexity behind this simple definition. The theory of social norms that Cristina has developed breaks down how behavior is informed by social expectations. That is, our understanding of what other people are doing and what other people think that we should do. She also studies the ways that social expectations are communicated within reference networks. Effective interventions depend on identifying community authorities and trendsetters who don't necessarily have a formal and identifiable role. Cristina's work is very pragmatic and easily applied to the real world. Through the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, which is headquartered at the University of Pennsylvania, she has consulted for UNICEF, the Gates Foundation, Microsoft, the World Bank, and the Government of India, among others. Her social norms theory has been applied in the field in projects in Colombia, Nigeria, Mali, and India, among other countries. I myself had the pleasure of working for Cristina in the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics from 2018 to 2019. I was a consultant to UNICEF Mali, where we were diagnosing the behaviors of child marriage and infant malnutrition and identifying relevant reference networks to drive change. I'm delighted that Cristina can join us today because I learned a tremendous amount from my work with the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. The beauty of social norms theory is that it is extremely plausible. We can see these social expectations at work in our own lives. As public policy students, I think we recognize that all public policy is essentially about behavioral change. This theory gives us a toolbox for understanding why people do what they do, which allows us to target behavior change interventions. Today's talk will be focused on norm nudges, that is, nudges that depend on shifting social expectations to achieve a certain outcome. These nudges can achieve durable social change, but also have the potential to backfire. Cristina will speak about important considerations when designing norm-based nudges and share some examples of applications in the real world. We'll devote the last 20 minutes of this talk to questions, and we'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box that you can find in the bottom of your screen. Please submit your questions there. With that, I turn it over to Cristina. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I prepared some slides so you can follow them. And the first slide is about what you all know probably very well, nudges. And typically, the interesting thing about nudges is they want to reframe the choice architecture without, the type of economic incentives, for example, that have typically been used, to change target behavior. And there are very common and successful examples. For example, organ donation. What you do, you use it as a default. In Austria, it's been used successfully as a default. At the time when people die, the default is that their organ, will be donated unless you opt out. Saving more in 401k plans, automatic enrollment versus opting out, and adherence to medication has been successfully implemented. There is a famous trial called the Encourage trial. And I quote all these examples because they are examples of nudging individual people on individual behaviors, okay? Now, Nudges, and this is what I'm talking about today, also work through what I call social comparison. So what I do is I compare your behavior, or I make you compare your behavior to the behavior of other people that may be of interest to you. For example, Halsworth has a very interesting paper in which they alert taxpayers that the majority pays taxes on time. So you know what the majority of people do, and then you can compare yourself to them. Another wonderful example is when Antanas Marcus was the mayor of Bogota. He really was a nudger, ante litteram. And one of the things it did, people in Bogota were driving like crazy, and there were lots of accidents and deaths within even center city. And so what he did, he hired a few mimes that went around, actually more than a few, that went around with thumb up, green card, thumb down, red card. And so they gave them to drivers, and every driver wanted a green card. And there was, again, this social comparison, and very public, okay? Marcus understood that it has to be very public. So these are simple examples of what I mean by social comparison. You compare yourself to somebody else. And what do you compare about? Well, you can inform about what other people do, or you can inform actually you can do both together, what other people approve or disapprove of. And the idea is, you will induce behavioral change. Now, there is a necessary assumption behind that. That is that the target behavior are interdependent and not completely independent. What does it mean? It means that my preference for behaving one way or another is conditional on what other people do, or whether they approve me or disapprove me for doing that. So this conditionality is crucial in norm nudging. Without that, there will be basically a lot of failure, okay? Now, so we want to change or induce expectation in order to change behavior. Now, which expectation do we want to induce or change? And I will show you examples in which both types of expectation have been induced and hopefully changed. One is what I call empirical expectation, what you expect other people to do, and the other is normative, what you expect other people approve or disapprove of. Now, there are few requirements that we need for norm nudging to be effective. First of all, you have to identify the mechanism through which different kind of information differently affect behavior. I will talk of that later. The second important thing, you have to understand the motivation for specific behavior. So do people litter out of convenience or because they observe other people littering? It's very important to know the difference. And also you have to understand the context in which the target behavior occurs. Think of the online classroom. We're all teaching online nowadays. And this is a new context. And students may disregard information that they believe does not apply to the new virtual context. And so nudging to ask questions in class may not work. Again, you have to be alert to the context and how people interpret the context. Okay, so where shall we start, okay, to do good norm nudging? First of all, we have to start thinking, understanding what motivates behavior. Because once you know that, then you know what sort of message will be effective. And I use in my work a very simple model of choice, but the interesting thing is all the concepts I use are measurable. This is very important to be able to measure, okay? We measure through survey, vignette, statistical analysis, etc., but we measure, and through measurement, we diagnose behavior. And what do we measure? We measure expectation through surveys. It's very easy to measure expectation, both empirical and normative. We measure reference networks. I'm coming to that in a second. We measure people preferences. And the most important measure is, are these preferences conditional on what they expect, what they believe or not? And at the end, we decide whether the behavior is independent or interdependent. This is very important discrimination. So social expectation, I say we measure the empirical, what people believe others do in a similar situation, and we measure the normative, what people believe other people believe one should do. So it's a second order belief, okay? I may ask you what you think is the right thing to do, but the most important thing is what you believe other people think is the right thing to do. This is very, very important in my calculation. Now, who are the others? This is very crucial. The others is what we call the reference network, okay? All social expectations are about a specific reference network. People whose behavior, beliefs matter to me in that moment. So when I drive in Philadelphia, my reference network is all the other drivers, people who walk, people on the bicycle. These are the people that matter to me. And I have certain expectation about their behavior. And I believe they expect me, for example, to stop at red light. And we coordinate our activities within that reference network. In a situation, let's say, where there is child marriage, what is the reference network? The reference network are typically other families in the village, if we're looking at the village, okay? Now, the reference network vary from situation to situation, as you can imagine. Depending on the target behavior, the reference network will be different. Now, what I mean by conditional preference looks like a very difficult idea, but it's very simple. We ask, do expectations matter to behavior? Do they have causal influence? If they do, whenever expectations change, behavior will change. So for a norm nudger, it's very important to understand whether preference for a certain target behavior are conditional on expectation or not. Because if I want to change expectation, but there is no conditionality, goodbye, it doesn't matter. And another question is, do some expectations matter to choice more than others? And I will show you yes, the answer is yes, some are more important. So the interesting thing, crucial for norm nudging is if preference for behavior are conditional on social expectation, then changing expectation, influencing expectation will change behavior. So this is the crucial idea behind norm nudging. So here I have this nice slide that I always show when I teach it to my student. There is a chain. And on the left, there are social expectations. On the right, there is behavior. And conditional preference are the causal link. What does it mean? For example, when we were studying in India open defecation, okay, we were asking, well, what motivates people, to behave in this particular way? Are their expectations? We measured their expectation about other people, etc., etc. And what we noticed is that there is no connection between their social expectation and their behavior. So expectations are not causally relevant for behavior. And in fact, that maybe say open defecation is a custom, is not a descriptive or social norm in any meaningful sense. So when you deal with norm nudging, this thing, the causal link, must be present. Because if it is not, you are in trouble. Now, the existence or non-existence of a causal link is what determines the big distinction I make between independent and interdependent behavior. So independent behavior, you can have all sorts of preferences, but all sort of expectation, but your preference for that behavior, your choice of that behavior does not depend on this expectation. You're not motivated by what other people do, what they think is appropriate, etc. And the typical example I give is using umbrellas when it rains. Everybody does it. I expect other people to do it. But, okay, my decision to go out with an umbrella is independent of what I expect other people to do. And in moral behavior, I personally think that moral behavior is also socially independent to be moral behavior. So I would not harm an innocent person for any reason, even if I think other people do that, or they even approve of doing that. You know, my moral behavior is independent, the choice is independent. Interdependent behavior, on the other hand, is all based on conditional preferences. Conditional on what? On my expectation, empirical or normative. For example, people who follow a fashion or a fad, okay, show interdependent behavior. They imitate other people, okay? Rules of etiquette, the same. There is a very important interdependence of expectation, convention, think of driving rules. Exactly, very important interdependence, and social norm, like norm of reciprocity, of cooperation, of fairness, are very strong, interdependent, okay? Because what other people do and think is appropriate matters to the decision maker. So the important thing, and here I give you a little graph to keep in mind. So a fine definition is a vertical one. On the left, you have independent decisions that are based on unconditional preference, socially unconditional, of course. And on the right, you have interdependence, descriptive, social norm, and whatnot. Now, a very coarse definition that you find in the literature is the definition of descriptive versus injunctive norm. And it's very problematic, especially for measurement, because descriptive norm is what is commonly done. Both a custom like open defecation and, traffic rules, tell us what is commonly done. But if you have to intervene, you have to understand what, is independent and what is interdependent. And the typical descriptive norm definition does not make this difference, which is very problematic when you want to do measurement and intervention. Same story with injunctive norm. What is approved or disapproved of doesn't distinguish between a social norm or a moral rule, because both, especially moral rule that we share or religious rules, are shared, okay, is what people approve of. But again, as I said before, my moral choice is independent usually by what other people do, while if I am in the grip, let's say, of a social norm, there is no independence to speak of. I care about what other people do, and I care what they think of me, and whether, there will be negative reciprocity, they will punish me if I don't behave. So again, remember, to me, the definition, the finer definition is vertical, independent versus interdependent. And the coarser definition in what you normally find descriptive injunctive norm is very messy. It's very messy for measurement and it's very messy for intervention. Now, when you diagnose behavior and you want to measure, what do you measure? How do you measure? Well, the first thing, you measure expectations. And people always have expectations about other people, about what other people think is right or wrong, etc. You find them all the time. The problem is you have to measure whether there is independence or interdependence, whether people prefer to follow the behavior no matter what others do, which is custom or moral norm, Why do you prefer? Because it meets a need. Open defecation, going out to defecate in the open, meets a basic need, and is often the only means they have to fulfill these needs. So what others do, you know what others do, but you don't care. And moral norm, again, you do it because you believe it's right. That's your motive, not because other people do it or not. And simple nudges work very well in this kind of environment. Sorry. Uh-oh. I don't see why. Okay. No. Oh my God. In this kind of environment, simply because the behavior is independent and you can nudge people with moral messages, you can nudge them with, messages about, behavior, how to behave in a better, more healthy way, etc., etc. And these are simple nudges. The most important part is the right-hand part. People behave, follow the target behavior because they have expectation. So there is interdependence. And there are two types of behavior, what I call descriptive norm proper. That is, my empirical expectations are enough to motivate my action. I drive on the right of the road because I expect everybody to do that, expect me to do that, etc. This is enough. It's in my interest, okay, to follow the rule. In the case of social norm, there is always a tension between my interest and collective interest. And if you read, for example, Elinor Ostrom, she wrote a lot about that, about social norm as reducing, solving, if you will, the tension because the individual and the collective. And so with social norms, we need two kinds of expectation, the empirical and the normative. And here, norm nudging work, not on the left side, but only on the right side. I hope I've been clear about that. This is very important. So, do descriptive and social norm need different messages? Yes, they do. Why? Look at, this driver. And, think about what happened in Sweden when they moved, the driving from the left to the right. Okay, it was very complicated at the beginning. There were lots of messages sent everywhere. But in the end, they succeeded. Coordination was very easy because it's interest of everybody to comply with the rule. Instead, if we look at social norm, and a typical norm where I live is, clean after your dog, okay? And, I know that people do that in my neighborhood, and I also think they will look down on me if I don't do that. So it is a social norm in this case, because there is this double component of descriptive and normative. And so the question is, how do you try to induce a descriptive norm versus a social norm? In the case of a descriptive norm, you have to provide motivation to people. So for example, people want to imitate, want to coordinate, and so you can nudge them with empirical message, with information about what other people do, or what other people don't do, or how many people do, what's the percentage, and so on and so forth. And so you want to give people to form new empirical expectations. This is the typical norm nudge, okay? After that, of course, people will coordinate, okay, their behavior, okay, and change will hopefully be more stable. Now, in a social norm is more complex because, as I told you, it has two components, okay? I prefer to conform to this rule of behavior on condition that I believe that most people in my reference network conform and that most people believe I ought to conform. And so the question is, how can we change or induce these social expectations that are much more complex than a simple convention or descriptive norm? And one path, but is one path, and this we will see later on, is difficult. Again, you have to motivate people, so you can nudge with normative message. Normative message in the sense of, oh, in a survey we did, most people show they approved, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that you will create new normative expectations. Warning, is not that easy, okay? And we will see why. But suppose you do that, this is one path, you will have to coordinate change, and in particular, coordinating change means making change public. So you can use public pledges, use the media, etc., but the publicity is very important, okay? People have to see that other people think that, or other people have an intention to do that, etc. Usually, the change is stabilized through sanction, through punishment, okay? And in small groups, we have seen that with, building toilet, coming out of open defecation, etc. You know, the villagers basically decide to move away from open defecation, build latrine, etc. But the first thing they do, they introduce sanction. They have children, let's say, going around and denounce people who still practice open defecation. So the sanction stabilize the new behavior. And when it's stabilized, you will have new empirical expectations that are created, okay? So one path is, again, to create the new normative expectation, but as we shall see, is not an easy path. Now, how is norm nudging typically performed? We have a lot of examples. One typical message is empirical. We tell people what other people do. So for example, I give you some very well-known example. You compare my electricity consumption to the consumption of neighbors, and this, according to Alcott, has reduced consumption. Now, the interesting thing is we need longitudinal studies, because an intervention, this is on all studies, an intervention may be successful, but in my experience, for example, with UNICEF, there is a slippage. After 3, 6 months, a year, they go down. So it's very, very important to be able to do longitudinal studies and to use surveys that you do at the beginning, but you keep doing to see, for example, if expectations have really changed or not. Okay, you can point the finger where there is slippage, what went wrong. Same story, Zion Bannot, a friend, did a wonderful study about water consumption in California. The interesting thing is he also added an injunctive message, a normative information. And he was very successful, reduced consumption. And Goldstein and other people told hotel guests that most other guests reuse unwashed towels. And this is a very interesting story because it's a story about reference network. So for example, the most successful intervention was when they tell people that other guests in their room, okay, behaved in the appropriate way versus other guests in the hotel or versus guests in hotels, okay? And it's very interesting because the intervention in which the reference network is really close, you can identify for some reason, but we do with people that, you know, like me, are in room 3 or 5, let's say. This had a very good effect. However, can fail. Like Schutz and other did, again, a comparison of electricity consumption to the neighbor. And what happened, and it's very interesting, you see people that are below average. They say, oh, I use less, then I can use more, okay? And so there was a sort of balancing of the act, and obviously it was a failure. They didn't obtain what they wanted. Now, another important thing you should never do is tell people how bad other people behave. In corruption campaigns, a very common message is there is too much corruption, so many high percentage of people bribe, etc. What is the fact? The fact is you normalize bribing. And this is a terrible effect. And another problem is when information is a little ambiguous, is not transparent and clear, you may allow what Jason Dana has called the moral wiggle room. So we can basically interpret what I am told in a way that is favorable to what I want to do. Another problem is the wrong reference network. If you use the wrong reference network, this is terrible because people will not respond. So it's very important, as I said at the beginning, to identify, you have a target behavior, you have a target population, what is the reference network? You have to identify it, okay? And last but not least, and it's something I'm studying actively now, I ask myself, what do we infer from empirical versus normative information? So if you give me purely empirical information, what most other people do, what do I infer? And actually, if that behavior is negative, I will infer that I approve of it. So very often we infer the normative from the empirical, and then I will show data from a nice experiment I did with my colleagues. Also, if you give a message about most people disapprove of, let's say, not paying taxes in time, do you think that people will infer that indeed people do pay taxes in time? I'm sorry, no. Okay, from a normative message, the inference to the empirical, to the real behavior is very weak. Cheap talk, words and deed are two different things, but this happens. And last but not least, when the empirical and the normative information are in conflict, the empirical will be much more powerful. And one example is the information about COVID-19. And on the media, we saw all these young people in Florida, okay, populating the beach, no social distance, no mask, nothing. And, I look at, I am from Milano, so I look at the Italian television and what's happening in Milano. As soon as they sort of were a little less, strong with the police in the street, young people went to the Movida places and were all there, no mask, nothing. So you receive this empirical information, but on the other hand, you receive a lot of normative messages saying one should not, people think one should not, etc. What do you do when you receive this message? And I can tell you from experiments, lots of experiments I did, the empirical wins. So it's very, very important, to be consistent. Now, why often norm nudging fails? As I said before, failure can be due to misunderstanding the relevant reference network. So if you tell me that most people do something, but I cannot identify with these people, they are, for example, people that have demographically very different from me, or they have different income, etc., etc. What I will do is I will discount this information. It's not like me. Of course they do that, but they have their reason. These are not my reason. And specifying the relevant reference network helps avoiding self-serving interpretation. And there is an example that I always use with my student, is a work by Halsworth. There was overprescription of antibiotics in England. And what they did, they informed general practitioners that they prescribed more than 80% of the GPs in their area. And this reduced antibiotic prescription, while the general practitioner identifies, well, what are other practitioners do in my area? So if you told in England in general, people may not have reacted that well because they may think, but in my area, there are so many more infections. Okay, so you can always interpret or reinterpret the information unless we focus on the relevant reference network. Another reason is trusting the messenger. So if people think that whoever sent the message, typically government, has a vested interest in supporting a certain behavior, well, the message will not be trusted. And we are doing now a big COVID-19 analysis and a huge survey in 9 different countries. And one thing we do, we measure trust, impersonal trust. So trust in institution, police, government, the legal system, etc. Because I believe that there is a correlation, but I cannot say yet because I have to see the result, a correlation between the level of, again, impersonal trust and the response to certain messages, okay? And another very important thing that psychology teaches us is that we reject information that is inconsistent with what we believe. We have fantastic example. Think of people who do not believe global warming or the Novax crowd. You can send all the scientific information you want, they are given to confirmation bias. They only look at what confirms. They go on the internet and look at information that confirm what they already believe, and certainly won't be very receptive to new scientific information. So this is very important. Now, up to now, I say what are the difficulties of an empirical message, a message about what other people do. What about normative message? Their effectiveness is very unclear. Now, there are 2 types of normative message. I can tell you the right thing to do is, or I can tell you, which may be a little bit more effective, what most people think the right thing to do is. And we have some data. Brent and other did normative message for water conservation. They were effective. And I quoted Zion Bannot, who added a normative information to empirical. But this is different because they use both, and I think using both may be successful, but using the normative alone may not be. Cialdini has a famous paper in which he says, there is a negative descriptive norm. People see a lot of trash in the garage, but, if we add a piece of paper with a positive normative message, they will behave differently. But reading that, I decided to do an experiment in which I contrast empirical and normative, and in my experiment, the result is completely, the empirical really wins, okay? Now, the most important thing is, again, when normative and empirical messages are incongruent, are in conflict, the negative empirical information wins out over the positive, is the work I did with Ertexian a long time ago. And the COVID-19 example I gave you is exactly that. The messages are incongruent. People will go for the empirical message that support what they want to do, basically. So pay a lot of attention. Never, give an incongruent empirical versus normative message. Another thing is, if you give a normative message, just saying not what other people think is right or wrong, but what is right or wrong, to say the right thing to do is, may provide the wrong type of information, So people may think, if you need to tell me what the wrong thing is, the right thing, sorry, is, it means that other people don't do it. So the inference again is, well, you tell me, but are other people doing it? Probably not. Or you wouldn't spend time doing this for me. So the inference I make is that most people behave badly. And this is very damaging if you send this information. And we know from psychology that typically what they call moralizing messages do not work. And one reason I think they don't work is exactly because people will ask, why do you need to send me this message? It means that people really, the majority misbehaves. Now, I'm sorry. Okay, and these are some results of a recent experiment I did with a bunch of people, and they are quoted here. And in this experiment, we basically look at all these issues I have discussed, but in a very controlled experimental setting. So for example, when we send either empirical or normative information, we see that very often the normative information is not questions, because the game we are dealing with is a trust game. And in a trust game, the idea is reciprocity is a norm. You reciprocate, you know, the investor gives you money, you give back something. And so people don't manipulate the normative information here because normative information is pretty stable and very credible. But when we give, you know, there are two groups of people, and one group has to sacrifice a lot to give back the money to the investor. They don't believe the empirical information we give them. You know, they don't believe that people in their position would do that. And therefore, when we combine punishment with this implausible empirical information, the result is terrible. It leads to extreme antisocial behavior, okay? So again, the credibility of information, especially empirical information you give, is very important. Another experiment we did, we wanted to see if there is motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning means basically that, you know, you choose your beliefs. And in particular, people choose beliefs that serve them well, that justify what they want to do. And in particular, in this experiment, we provided people with information about an uncertain state of the world. So you can choose whether, you know, it is true that most people lied, or is it true that most people didn't lie? And is it true that most people disagree with lying, or do you think most people agree with lying? Okay, and we let people decide. And of course, the agreement or disagreement, lying or not lying, were real data from a previous game. And we see that there is enormous belief distortion with empirical message. So people tend to say, oh, it must be true that most people lied, especially when they know that we'll have to play the game and we'll be able to lie. So there is a lot of belief distortion in the empirical, not with the normative message. Why? Because as I told you, there is an asymmetry between the normative and empirical information. We tend to infer the normative from the empirical, not the other way. And look, we did a subsequent experiment. So what I ask people, I tell you, look, in the experiment, and then I'm telling the truth, the majority did not lie. Okay, they did not lie. Now, please tell me, did you think the majority approve of lying or disapprove of lying? And look at the blue line. They believe that 77% disapprove of lying. They did not lie. It must be that they disapprove of lying. So they infer the normative attitude, if you will, from the behavior. Now look at the other one. The message we give is, hey, I'm telling you, the majority in this game disapprove of lying. You know, we survey them and this is the result. Now, please tell me, what do you think the majority did? And it's almost 50-50. They don't believe that this high majority that disapprove of lying is also not lying. Okay, they may think cheap talk, words and deeds, whatever. But this is a very interesting little experiment, and doing more as we speak, about the asymmetry between the empirical and the normative. And if there is asymmetry and you do norm nudging, well, beware, watch out, okay, what you're telling people. So my conclusion is that, first of all, we know that people find it easier to infer the normative from the empirical, but not vice versa. And second, beware providing information about antisocial behavior, because this will lead to a cascade of bad behavior. So you tell bribing is very prevalent here. It's common, it's accepted, I will bribe, okay? And the question is very often people observe antisocial behavior. And so our question is how to mitigate the effect of this observation, how to mitigate the effect on norm compliance. And here we did another interesting example in which, you know, the experiment is an experiment of giving or taking away or doing nothing with a charity, okay? And the norm is very strong. You don't take money away from a charity. You don't rob a church, okay? So the norm is very strong. And so individuals in a repeated game can violate the norm, take away money or give money or leave the money as is. And the problem is when people start observing bad behavior, there will be a cascade of terrible behavior. So what we did, we introduced a treatment in which there is group identification, there is social proximity, and I don't want to go too much into that. But basically, people know they are in a group, is a sort of common knowledge, in which people really are very similar to them in one respect. In this case, we chose sport fandom. But there are lots of experiments, Cashfell and Turner, with a minimal group paradigm. But anyway, social proximity is important. I think in real life, we have to use a group identification that is a little stronger than the minimal group paradigm. And I think it will work. Because what happens that social proximity that is relevant to these people, so there is a group identification, mitigates the fact of observing bad behavior. So when people observe some good, some bad behavior, there is a balancing, okay? And this is a very, very important point when you want to change behavior, to introduce more pro-social behavior in a situation where bad behavior may be the norm, okay? So what you have to do, and this I do in my work, I say, why don't you identify a small group of people that refrain from that behavior and show that there is an advantage to them to doing that? And this can be very powerful. So basically, you know, these, sorry. Oh my God, doesn't go, okay. These are my conclusions, that interdependent behavior are crucial, is crucial to determine that behavior are interdependent, that is, that people preference, choice of that behavior depends on their social expectations, because otherwise norm nudging will not work. And the effectiveness of norm nudging depends on several items. First, avoid uncertainty, ambiguity, moral wiggle room. Choose, second, the appropriate reference network, and elicit, if you can, group identification. Third, use trusted messages. for conveying information, okay? So the messenger must be trusted, must be credible. Show public example, as I said a minute ago, of positive behavior, even small. Show that, okay? And remember always the asymmetry between empirical and normative information. Common, some people say common is moral. I don't want to use the word moral, but common is acceptable. Okay, what is common is acceptable. Disapproving doesn't imply that you will act on your disapproval. And when you have conflicting empirical and normative information, the empirical, will be stronger. Okay, so we can go. Oh, one thing I wanted to show you, if you are interested in learning more about norms, I have to book, the most recent is Norm in the Wild, which talks about all the things I have been discussing today, because it talks about my work with UNICEF especially. And you can check our sites, Norm and Behavior, which has a lot of stuff and a lot of research. Thank you. Okay, how do we eliminate? Stop sharing. Here I am. Okay, and now we have, I'm sorry, here, what's happening? Okay, there are questions. Q&A, okay, oh my God.
So we have a lot of questions.
Yes, I see that.
Let's try and move through them because we've gotten so much engagement from our audience. I'd like to start off with a question from Raymond Fissman.
Let me see the question.
So
yes.
I can read the question to you. Raymond asks, do you have any thoughts relevant to the modern moment? Do you have any thoughts on promoting mask wearing and other norms that are relevant to current circumstances? He's particularly interested in your thoughts on how this interacts with partisanship that leads to mixed or conflicting messages from political leaders.
Thank you. This is very important. This is part of what I was saying about the messages that we receive on COVID-19. On the one hand, when people receive conflicting messages, they see different things. You tell me, there is an enormous risk, but then I see people going around and I say, well, they must think otherwise. Okay, they are not crazy. It must be that the risk is not so high, etc., etc. So this is very important. And obviously we cannot control the media or the messages that we receive. But if I could give an advice to politicians, to the president, etc., is be consistent. Be consistent, because inconsistency is the kiss of death. In this case, really the kiss of death. All right, so this is my answer. Another interesting thing that I think has been overlooked is there were lots of messages about the people who are more likely to get sick and die. And we say it's older people, people with pre-existing condition, etc. And I don't think, though it was true, I don't think it is a good message, because it relies on young people pro-social instinct. Say, okay, well, let's help my grandmother. Okay, but it doesn't make them very conscious that there is a risk for them too. Okay, and so I think all the messages, protection, putting mask on, etc., combined with the information that is mostly older, sick people who die, is not very productive. So the idea is that you would have to increase the risk perception in young people, which is very low at this point.
Thank you, Cristina. For our next question, we're going to turn to Professor Jen Lerner. She asks, how do we know whether a behavior is independent or interdependent? We can ask people, but is self-reporting accurate? wouldn't they underestimate social influence due to the fundamental attribution error? And thus, is the empirical approach the only way to truly know if a behavior is independent or interdependent?
Jen is an old colleague of mine from Carnegie Mellon. I love her. Hi, Jen. And it's a very good question. So how do we measure? We measure, the measures are always incentivized, okay? So let's suppose I am measuring, let's say, child marriage. And I am in an area where there is a high percentage of child marriage. What I will ask are, the personal belief of people about child marriage. And of course, you cannot incentivize that. People tell you whatever they want. Then I measure what are their expectations about the percentage of people that do child marriage in their neighborhood, and we know that, and I can incentivize this expectation. And so I can say, if your answer is within a certain range, you will get some sort of prize. Okay, we cannot give money typically, but we can give a time on the phone, on the cell phone, and so on and so forth. Then I ask personal normative beliefs. That is, what do you believe, is the right thing to do for your daughter, etc. And they know I am asking everybody, and then incentivize. How do you think the majority responded? And if you are within a certain range, then you get a prize. So I always incentivize exactly to avoid what we call, the experimental effect, because people know that we are against, let's say, child marriage, and we get very interesting and usually very good results. And after that, so I have all these expectations incentivized, and then I give the simplest methodology. Then I want to know if these expectations have an effect on behavior, and if changing them would change behavior. And so what I do vignettes. And what sort of vignettes I do? I never, the main character in the vignette, and will be different if I ask a young person, older person, man, woman, I will have different vignettes. And the main character is a character which is relevantly similar to the person I am questioning. So lives in a village, same size of village, same situation. And and this person, has moved from one place to another. So in this new village, very similar. And what I do, I basically vary, okay, the empirical and the normative information. So I may say, oh, they notice that there isn't that much child marriage. However, they are repeatedly told by the village members that the right thing to do is doing that. So the normative and empirical are incongruent in, in different dimensions, etc. And then I measure basically what people say, how they respond. And then I have an idea of, first of all, if these expectations, these different expectations, have an effect on what they think the protagonist, the main character, will do. What do you think this person will do? And, if indeed there seems to have an effect, so there is a conditional preference that we also measure statistically, don't worry, then at this point, I have a clearer idea of whether empirical messages are more important, normative messages are more important, if they are in conflict, which is more important. So I do a very accurate study of that. Any more questions from Jen?
So officially, Cristina, we've reached the end of our time. Can we impose upon you for another 15 to 20 minutes to get through a few more questions? If you have to go, I understand.
No, I'm here.
Okay. I'm going to go out on a limb and combine two questions now. From Lena Restrepo, Lena asks, can we still call something a nudge if sanctions are involved? And then I've lost my second one.
No.
Well, that's a quick answer. And then Mia Karabegovich asks, are sanctions, that is to say punishment, a necessary condition for making nudges work? Or are reputational effects, such as social rewards, enough to produce an effect?
Going to the second question first, sanction can be positive and negative. And sometimes rewards are as good as punishment. I mean, it depends on the situation, of course. You know, when a behavior, a prosocial behavior is particularly difficult, we tend to reward, you know, this behavior. There will be a higher reputation, you know, enhanced reputation, etc. Answering to Lina, hi Lina, is another friend. You know, the punishment is not related to the nudge. The nudge is basically the informational part. You know, you give people information. Now, what they do with the information is another story. But the first part, always in changing or inducing new norm, is giving people information with behind, you know, your intervention. There is the idea that they respond to this information, that this information basically that they have conditional preferences. But this you have to know in advance. The big problem of lot of nudging is they don't know really, okay, what is the right motivation. And if you don't know, you may fail, but then you don't know why you failed. And it's like people who litter because it's convenient. You can send 3,000 messages that may not care. So this is very important always to know, okay, what motivates people. And my job is basically 90% measurement.
Thank you. Let's turn to, from your experience, this is a question from Ryan Chan. From your experience working particularly in the developing world and in context with limited institutional capacity, how can we go about designing nudges without much money, without much monetary incentive, and without much social or institutional capital?
That's a very good question. I think, again, when we're talking, you know, there are nudges and nudges. There are purely individual nudges. This is one thing. And maybe you need more money for that. Okay, they are more expensive. And instead, and so the institutional setup is more important there. In the case of norm nudges, paradoxically, they are easier. Because the idea is you want to give people information after you have decided that giving this information will indeed be relevant, will change or initially change the target behavior. And so given information is not something, you know, is some work we do, I'm now doing in India, in Tamil Nadu, we're doing basically experimenting with different type of information. And, you know, you may think, oh my God, it's so expensive. We know that, for example, soap operas are very, very, very successful often. But of course, this requires a lot of money. And the Gates Foundation has funded it, the BBC funds it, so it's not out of this world. But you may just use much more primitive means, like, you know, groups that discuss together and decide together to do something, and you give the information about what they have done and decided to other groups, you know, sending information through very simple means, like loudspeakers in villages, etc., etc. So honestly, I believe that norm nudging can be easier and cheaper. What is not cheap is the work you do before, is all the measurement, because you have to do big survey and they cost money. But apart from that, I think the very norm nudging is not particularly expensive.
Thank you. To switch to an unrelated note, let's talk about generational differences in norm nudging. We have a question from Annie Wu, who is a middle school teacher, and she's curious if you have any thoughts about using norms and nudging specifically within classrooms and with young students. Are impacts of nudging different on young students versus adults?
Well, it depends what sort of nudges, of course. But young people are very, very sensitive to their group. You know, usually you remember, you know, kids want to be popular or wants to dress like the popular kid in class, etc., etc. So there is a lot of imitation among younger kids. And so I would try to bank on that, okay? And so, for example, there are always trendsetters among kids, people who are more admired, who have, in some sense, more power. And so the idea would be to act on the trendsetters, to identify the trendsetter for a particular behavior and try to convince them and incentivize basically this type of behavior. And I think other kids will follow them. But I will bank on the fact that the kids really imitate each other a lot. Adults do too, but I think less.
A question from Alina Halonen. Do you have thoughts on cultural differences? Some countries or cultures are identified as more collectivistic, more interdependent, whereas other countries, generally speaking, can be defined as more independent. How do you evaluate the existing forms of cultural communication and apply norms in different settings?
This is a crucial question. It's very interesting. It's part of the study I am doing in 9 different countries for COVID-19. And among the country, there are China and South Korea. And the interesting thing, and I discuss it often with my Chinese students, especially many of them, these cultures are very traditional, are much more traditional. They don't put a premium on individualism and autonomy. Our culture does. And it's interesting, if you look at what's happening in the United States, in a lot of places where people do not want to wear masks, so reject this kind of injunction, in the name of what? In the name of autonomy. You know, I have to decide, this is very American, I have to decide whether I wear a mask or not. You know, you can tell me to stay at home. If I want to take, you know, a walk out, I will do that, etc., etc. So I think there are huge differences between more autonomous, freedom-oriented, individualistic cultures and very collectivistic cultures where the collective is more important than the individual. Huge difference. You will have probably different norms. I was discussing, I give you as a story with a Chinese student. Okay, Chinese traditionally didn't shake hands. Chinese bow, okay? And she was telling me, this is an old sort of convention that is born again because they don't want to shake hands, and so it's very natural. And she was telling me, do you think Americans will bow? I said, not in their real life, because bowing is almost a sign of submission. Okay, so there are, you know, this is a little stupid example, but it's interesting because there are important cultural differences and, you know, changing behavior. And I believe that this COVID-19, if it lasts a long time, behavior will change. And the interesting thing is, how will it change? can we predict how it will change in Oriental countries that are much more collectivistic versus our countries that are much more individualistic? This is a very interesting question. I may have some answer from the COVID-19 study, but you know, I don't have all the data.
Yeah, and you spoke very compellingly about the importance of longitudinal data in measuring and understanding social norms.
Right.
A good segue to a question from Sean Lahiri, who asks if you can speak a little bit about statistical models of social norms change. Particularly, Sean asks if you have modeled social norms through Bayesian methods, where an individual updates their prior beliefs based on the responses of their reference network. That is to say, iterative change in social norms. Can you speak about how one...
And this is very interesting. There is, is something that interests me a lot. Do people update? There are what has been called motivated Bayesians. What does it mean? It fits with all the story about motivated reasoning I was talking about. Very often, people, let's think of people who, and I have this data, who practice open defecation. If you look at their at the numbers, at their perception of what other people do, they overestimate it. Okay, so they are justified. Everybody does it, etc., etc. Now, the interesting thing when you see overestimation or underestimation is what happens when you give these people the real numbers. And I think I will see a difference. If there was motivated reasoning, they may discount the information. They may say, well, you know, maybe not here. You know, they may have tons. We usually are very smart inventing reason, you know, to discount information. So they will become at least very prudent Bayesians. Okay. They will say, well, I need more evidence. That's not enough. You know, they will not update really immediately. And so in that case, I would say what we discover is that people are given to motivated reasoning. Okay, exactly when we give them information, oh look, the numbers are these, then I will see if people update or not. So this is the answer. And my hunch is probably many of these people are motivated Bayesians. They don't shift very quickly immediately.
Thank you. That's a very interesting response. My next question comes from my fellow panelist, Maya Niksich. Maya wants to know, how can we nudge COVID-19 norms in the US in a way that addresses Americans' value systems? That is to say, a value system where personal freedom may be seen as at odds with public health and public safety.
That's very interesting, you know, and that is something that when I look on TV at what's happening, I ask myself too. So how can we nudge these people with the right amount of information to behave more pro-socially? The question is, they probably have a low-risk perception because nobody in his or her sane mind would behave like that if they perceive the risk to be high, okay? And here we have a problem because some politicians have downplayed the risk, okay? And so this is a tragedy, basically. And so the question to me is how to increase risk perception. Because if you basically play their freedom, autonomy, etc., versus the public good, and the public good is abstract, okay? I don't think it will be very successful. I'm very pessimistic in this respect. I think the most important thing would be from some authoritative source, some source that they really believe and trust, increase significantly the risk perception. Because I don't think, again, and also with young people, same story, as I said, I don't think that pushing the public good message is very helpful. You have to instill some fear.
Thank you, Cristina. I think we've come to our last question of the day, and this one is quite open-ended. Given your experience working with diverse partners in a lot of different countries, what is the most effective social norms intervention that you've ever been involved in? Which one do you think has had the most durable effect on shifting social expectations and affecting a change in behavior?
That's a good question. So that's very interesting. We had some success, but they don't pay for longitudinal studies. And so whether there was leakage or not, I don't know. So I won't claim success unless I know that in the long run, this has happened. One thing that I am doing at present in India, we realized that adopting, so building and using, because you build and you not use, building, using, keeping functional the latrines, the toilet, is more of a descriptive norm than a social norm. What matters to people is what other people around them do, okay? And another interesting thing, at the beginning, I was thinking there would be a sort of an aspirational level. Oh, richer people have toilet. Wrong. What I realize is the aspiration is very much limited to what people like you do. So what people that are at your level do. You don't care what poorer, richer people, etc. People seem to care a lot about people they can identify with. This is one thing. And the second, it looks like we have a paper coming out, I hope soon, that adopting a latrine is a descriptive norm, is not a social norm. Okay, and we're doing all these studies, etc. now, but I think, I believe it will be successful if we attack it in this way. In the other cases, there is no longitudinal study, so I can say, oh yes, we were very successful. I don't know.
Cristina, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really fascinating talk because we speak so often about social norms and the theoretical implications of this sort of behavior change, and it's really valuable to see how this theory applies in the real world and the ways that you have worked with policymakers who are taking new perspectives on perennial problems. So I thank you very much for your time. This talk has been very pertinent because I think that we are discovering today more than ever that we live in a world of complicated reference networks and rapidly changing social norms. Our behavior today does not look like our behavior 2 months ago. And it's fascinating to understand the expectations that underlie that change. To all attendees, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to put 2 links in the chat. The first is to normsandbehavior.sas.upenn. That is the website to the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, which includes the Social Norms Group, the consulting branch of Cristina's work. I'm also including a link to the Behavioral Insights Group. We are housed at the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. If you're interested in learning more about either Cristina's work or the Behavioral Insights Group's work, please follow those 2 links and you can subscribe to newsletters, read Cristina's publications and recent work, and generally stay up to date. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you, Sam, Maya, and all the people who attended. It was very pleasant. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.